Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Kristen Comives. I'm the Director of Programs for the ISEAL Alliance, and it's a pleasure to be the moderator for this session today about living wage. A little bit about me. In addition to working for ISEAL, I have been supporting the Global Living Wage Coalition for the last few years, a coalition that was started by ISEAL member standard systems to try to align on definition and measurement of living wages. So that's my background to this topic. And you'll hear more about the legacy of this Global Living Wage Coalition in the presentations today. For those of you just arriving, and it's maybe new to these breakout rooms, be aware that you are in listen-only mode because of the large number of people that we have. You can change the configuration of your screen if you would like to, so you can choose tiled view or full screen in order to better see the slides. There's also a plus sign and a minus sign that allows you to increase or decrease the size of the slides as they come up. And you will have an opportunity to enter questions later today. There's a question box and you can enter questions there. And time permitting, we'll take some of these questions at the end of the day. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the two speakers we have today, and let's get started with our presentation. So I'm pleased to be joined by Carla Romeo Dalmo, who is from IDH, the Dutch Sustainable Trading Initiative, and also Kamini Visvanathan, who's from RSPO and the lead on living wage there. So we're going to start with Carla, and Carla is going to introduce us to the idea of what is a living wage and how it's measured and what sort of methodologies are out there. Carla, please go ahead.
Thanks, Kristen. If you don't say otherwise, I assume that you can see the slides and that is in the right mode. So thanks for the introduction. I will briefly indeed explain a bit more on the topic of living wage, and then we will go more in depth, but we thought it's good that everybody's in the same page. When we talk about living wage, let me see it now. Yes. Sorry, my internet connection might be a bit slow, so if you see my picture moving less quick, is my fault. So when we talk about living wage, there are different angles to look at it. The first is how you define a living wage. The second is, okay, if that's a living wage in a place, then how are wages now and how far are we from a living wage? So that's what we call the living wage gap. Here is in the second bucket. Then the third is how you track this data and verify this data, and that's a key role that standards are helping us with. And then there is the step, if that's a living wage and we are here, how to get there, right? How to close the gap. So that's why at IDH we have organized our work on living wage into this roadmap that you see in the screen. And just for clarification, living wage means a wage that enables a worker to have a decent standard of living. And I will then briefly explain more on how you get to this number. Briefly to say, in this roadmap, what we are doing at IDH is to try to find this alignment, as the Global Living Wage Coalition started doing many years ago. And now there is several companies already working on the topic, and there is several companies making the first steps towards assessing living wages in their supply chains and how far are current wages from that. So that's why at IDH we have set up this roadmap where we have several companies that you can see on the top, but also the standards. And we have RSP also working with us in the technical advisory group, since this is a very much a joint effort, right? In order to get the data and to get the work going. If we go on to the topic of living wage, What it means is what is the remuneration, and by remuneration we include cash wages, but we also include in-kind benefits, right, and bonuses. So the total remuneration package that is given to a worker, can it cover for the basic cost of living for the family? So to calculate the living wage, you look into food cost, housing, education, healthcare, and so on. In a specific region in the world, right, it will not be the same, the cost of living in a city or in a rural area. So that's why there is quite a lot of work to be done on benchmarks, to say in this area, in this country, that's a living wage, versus in the same country in another area, it's different. And that's the work that the Global Living Wage Coalition, with all the standards that support it, started working several years ago. And at IDH, we are very much looking at these benchmarks as a golden standard. And there is also other methodologies that have been working on setting up these benchmarks. So at IDH, we have set up what we call a recognition process to assess which benchmarks we recommend companies to use. We will not go in detail on that, but feel free to reach me or look at our website to know more about that. Then once you have a living wage, right, this North Star, then we need to see what our current wage is and how far are we from this living wage. With the work of other partners, such as Rainforest, that also work with us on creating this salary matrix, this is a tool that is available online for everyone to use, that allows any company to apply the tool in their own supply chain or in their own producer facility to see how far are the wages that are being paid from a living wage. You can see here in this slide the output, and I will briefly explain you because I think then it helps better understand what you can get with this tool. And on the red side, on the left, are all the workers that are below a living wage. And on the green side, on the right, there are all the workers that are above a living wage. And you see a dashed line, that is the living wage. So what is this graph showing is on the y-axis, the wages. On the bottom is different type of workers, right? Within a plantation, within a factory, not all workers have the same salary. And also with the split on gender. So the tool enables you to see from one production area, that's all the workers that are there, that's the workers that are below a living wage, that's the workers that are above a living wage. And you can maybe see that there is different kinds of ways that we assess wages. As we said, is not only the salary in itself, but it's also the bonuses and the in-kind benefits, which as the work done by the Global Living Wage Coalition, the in-kind benefits are capped at 30%. But in a nutshell, this graph shows the gap, right? How big is the gap? So you see on the left, there is 18%. That means that these workers that are the ones that are more below a living wage are still 80% away from a living wage. So we believe this is a great tool to start discussing. Now, how do we do it, right? Now we have an idea of the workers in a plantation, how far are they? Some are already with having a living wage, some are not. So this is a great start for having a conversation within a supply chain on how to close the gap. On that note, I'm going to pass it to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Carla, for that introduction. And now we'll move to Kamini, and Kamini is going to tell us more about what IDH has been doing with living wage and how it's included now in the principles and criteria. To you, Kamini.
Thanks, Kristen. But I think you meant what's RSPO doing and how we've included it in the
Oh,
principles.
sorry, excuse me. Yes.
No worries. Hi everyone. So it's really interesting, and how Carla has basically presented to us. You'll see what are the elements that is necessary for us to sort of determine what a decent living wage was, or is rather. It is relatively subjective, and it also looks into what is the specific need within the area, the geographical area that the workers are working in, with the ultimate aim of us elevating poverty. So, with that in mind, the RSPO principles and criteria, which is reviewed every 5 years, was recently reviewed in 2018. That was the last review. And at that point, we had moved from requiring that our members pay a minimum wage to an indicator which very clearly says that pay and conditions for staff and workers and for contract workers always meet legal or industrial minimum standards that are sufficient to provide a decent living wage. So the next question that we had was, what does this decent living wage mean? And this is something that was questioned by our members as well as our stakeholders alike. So a lot of work that we're doing right now is to move towards creating an awareness of what decent living wages are, and looking at the elements. And I'm gonna just show you a really quick slide here. So where we are right now is figuring out what is it in the palm oil industry which is so different from other commodities, for instance, where we are. Because the interesting thing about RSPO members, as well as growers or producers of palm oil, is that there are many in-kind benefits that are provided to their workers, which are included into a calculation of a decent living wage. For instance, many producers provide housing for their workers. Some of them even provide, schools or even facilities. Some even provide books. So the provision of a minimum wage in their particular country doesn't necessarily reflect what is the total expenditure for the remuneration of a worker. So in that sense, what we're trying to do is to educate or bring more awareness to our members in terms of, hey, you guys, there are a lot of things that you are already providing, which feeds into a calculation of a decent living wage. So what we need to now know is how far are we from a benchmark, or how far are we from an estimate from where you are right now. So a lot of our work for the past 2 years has been around this, around creating awareness, around creating an awareness of where we are, what the decent living wage is, and how far we've got to go before we reach that aim. But always having that elevation of poverty as one of those targets in our theory of change that we are trying to meet through this entire concept, or the payment of a decent living wage.
Thanks, Kamini. And it's always so exciting for us from ICEAL to see what our ICEAL members are doing and advancing on these topics. So thanks for sharing with us where RSPO is on this. With that, I'm going to turn back to Carla, and Carla is going to tell us a little bit more about what IDH has been learning about advancing towards a living wage by the work that they're doing with companies in various sectors.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, we have tried to summarize in a short list what are the steps that can be done. Once you have an idea of what Kamini was also explaining, right? That's in our sector how wages are, and that's a living wage. Maybe it's closer, maybe it's less near. So then what do we do? So we always talk about the supply chain approach, right? This is not an effort that can be done by suppliers alone. This is an effort that needs to be shared among the different participants in a supply chain. So here, if you allow me, we have put it a bit simplistic, but from one side, we talk about what suppliers and workers can do to close the gap, and from the other side, what can the buyers do? And we know that there are many other players in several supply chains, but just for simplicity, we like to present it like this. So from a supplier point of view, there is sometimes room in some sectors to improve quality and productivity, and with these improvements, also wages increases can be linked. That's something we have, for instance, done in the tea sector. There is also room sometimes to work with worker representation and social dialogue, right, to enable workers to have a system where they can also themselves negotiate their wages and have a dialogue between the workers and the company representative through unions, through a different type of organizations, depending on the country, right? But there is also room to work on that, empowering workers for them to also be able to have conversations on the topic. Then there is also the route, as Kamini was also mentioned, very important for all palm sector on in-kind benefits. There is room to increase wages through increasing in-kind benefits or through calculating well the in-kind benefits that are given. So that's just some ideas on what can be done in this part of the supply chain. On the buyer side of the supply chain, what we work with brands, with retailers, with any type of buyers. When we talk to them on the topic, say first step is understanding the topic, as also Kamini was mentioning, right? There is a bit of awareness first that needs to be done on the topic, and then it's about commitments and setting targets, as some players have done, for instance, in the banana sector. And then we need to apply this, or that's our advice at IDH, to have an idea of how big are the gaps in the supply chain, and that's why we advise to use the salary matrix. If you rule out the salary matrix in the supply chain, then you see where are your gaps, and then you can start talking to suppliers and start discussing with them how you can work together on either the activities you see on the left, right? On how can we help you on improved quality of productivity, how can we work together on social dialogue, and also there is the other part of procurement, right? There is also work that can be done on adopting more sustainable procurement practices. Sometimes producers benefit hugely if there are longer contracts, if there is, a horizon of 3-5 years, so then the producer feels that they can invest more if they are being secured that the buyer will keep sourcing from them, right? So there are many conversations that can happen on the co-investment side of activities on the field, but also on the procurement side, and of course another route could be through pricing, and that's a route, for instance, that the fair trade standard also very much uses through the premiums. So that's a bit of a summary of what can be done. And just one last thought, what to take into consideration when you work on this topic. We have learned that it's very important to work at more than one producing country at a time, to avoid putting too much pressure in one producing country. So, for instance, in tea, we work very much first in one country, that was Malawi, and it can create risk, right? If you put all the pressure on the living wage topic only in one producing country. So our advice always, when you tackle this topic, look at most of the producing countries on this case in OPAM, right? And then our other advice is sometimes companies can close the gap on their own, but many other times companies need to join a coalition because sometimes the problems of wages are very much structural, right? So then the coalition route often is a route that can help when the living wage is very big, the living wage gap is very big, or the company leverage is very small. If the company only sources 1% of one factory volumes, then maybe it's worth joining a coalition. So this here just some thoughts, and more can be found in our website. Thanks.
Thanks, Carla. And now, Kamini, back to you. Let's focus now on palm oil sector in general, and what are you learning with your experience? What are some of the challenges and opportunities that you're uncovering?
So yeah, that's a very interesting question. So when we first embarked on this journey towards the payment of decent living wages, we started to have a lot of conversations, and we started speaking to organizations like IDH, speaking to the JLWC to see, where we are, what are the kind of challenges that the other industries have faced, and how do we then move forward. So one of the greater challenges is, as you would see, palm oil is currently produced in 16 countries, or rather, this is the membership, the countries where our members are. So we're looking at 16 countries, and we're looking at very different sort of cultures, very different sort of economies, very different sorts of workforces. So as we delved into the work, we started realizing that, hey, we can't, it's not a one solution fits all sort of situation. So we need to start looking at, having a very uniformed approach, but still having something that takes into account the subjectivities of the local considerations in those particular countries. So we've started having a lot of conversations, both with organizations like IDH, the GLWC. But what we've done also, we've started this dialogue going on with our members. And as our members comprise of different stakeholders, we're getting a lot of feedback. And we're also looking at, how now do we move? So one of the considerations is, let's start with assessing what the benchmarks are going to look like. So what is the value of a decent living wage in a particular area or particular locality that we're working in? And it's a bit unfortunate for the RSPO that most of our the countries where palm oil is produced, there are no available GLWC benchmarks yet. So then we have the challenge of, okay, so now where do we go from there? How do we come up with something that is feasible for both the palm oil industry as well as something that we could use for the future? So at this moment, we are looking at developing benchmarks and looking at what would be feasible and how do we go about it in a way that we will come up with something that's credible and usable, really, more than anything else, by the membership, and something that would actually go back to our main goal at the end of the day, which is poverty elevation for our workers. So the way we see it, or the way we're discovering now, they're very different sort of situations. For instance, in Malaysia, you will have most of the palm oil workers in Malaysia are migrant workers. So then the question arises, if I'm going to be providing a decent living wage for a person who is working in Malaysia, but his family lives in Nepal, for instance. So which benchmark do we look at? Do we look at where the family is living, or do we look at Malaysia? So, and then similarly, we are also looking at the regulations of specific countries, and looking at the minimum wages of a country, and see how does that correlate back to the decent living wage methodology that the RSPO has adopted. So I think what has triggered right now, or where we are right now, is having these conversations and looking at what is feasible as that can be done for the industry. So what can work? We're also looking at, as I mentioned just now, what are the kind of in-kind benefits that are provided, which are common across the industry. So whether a person is in Colombia or whether a person is in Ghana, he's still receiving the same sort of benefits simply by working for an RSPO member. So these are the kind of questions that we are asking right now. We are engaging with our local members, our local partners in each country. And Carla, it was really interesting that you brought up the fact that we should not look at a specific area in isolation. So we are trying to actually move collectively as an organization, and not zone into each country in particular. It's a bit, we're moving along, I think, rather effectively, despite the pandemic. We're trying to see how we can, get over the issue of traveling, get over that obstacle of not being able to be present in certain areas, and try to see how we can actually get those information online. So it's challenging, but I don't think it's impossible. It's just, trying to think about creative ways for us to move forward with this agenda.
Thank you. Thanks. And so now we have a few minutes left where we're going to take some questions from the audience. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the question box. And while we're waiting for those questions, Carla, I'm just going to ask, we heard Now Community talk about the situation in Palm. Is there another sector that you could give us a little bit more detail about how a sector has tackled this question of living wage?
Yeah. Sure. I think one interesting example for us is the banana sector. We at IDH, we are based in the Netherlands, and what has happened in the last year is that the Dutch retailers have made a commitment on closing the living wage gap in their supply chain in the next 5 years. So to our knowledge, this is, if if not the first, one of the first commitments from most of the retailers in a country to say in the next 5 years, the bananas that come to our country will be living wage bananas, right? So that was the first step, this commitment, which, as you can imagine, it also takes time to get there. We have now more than 90% of the retailers working with us on this commitment, and now we are doing the first steps. First step that needs to happen after this commitment in our advice is to map your supply chain and map where are the bananas coming from and how are wages in these countries that you source from and how far are they from a living wage. So here it resonates very well with what Kamini is saying. Um, I guess in the banana sector, we are now a bit more advanced because we have benchmarks for almost all the countries that retailers are sourcing from. And now we have already ruled out the salary matrix. So we expect in a month we will have map the gaps in most of the supply chain of the Dutch retailers, the living wage gaps. And now with these gaps, with these numbers, is when the retailers and the suppliers can open the discussion on now how do we honor this commitment and start closing the gap. So in 5 years, the Netherlands can sell bananas that are already living wage bananas. So a lot of learnings there, but I will stop here.
Thanks. So I'm looking at the questions that are coming in here, and actually we have quite a few that are about the intersection between living wage and something that we call living income. So let me just take a moment to tell everyone else in the audience what that means, and then we can take a couple questions on that point. So as Carla mentioned, the way that living wage is calculated starts from the concept of what is the cost of a basic but decent standard of living for a family. And then you divide that by the average number of workers in a typical family to arrive at what one worker would need to bring home in order to contribute effectively to the family having what it needs to live basic but decent standard of living. That concept of the cost of the basic but decent standard of living for a family is also used within the smallholder agricultural sector as a living income. So what would a smallholder need to earn from all sources of income in order to try to cover that as a farming household to live that decent, basic but decent standard of living? So I'm wondering, Kamini, if you could just speak briefly to this question of how you at RSPO are thinking about living income and living wage from the perspective of smallholder farmers, and how do they fit into your living wage strategy or not?
Right, thanks. So that's actually a very pertinent question. I think where we are right now, when we're looking at the livelihoods elevation of the smallholders, is we're very much focused on our livelihood income in the smallholder strategy within the RSPO. And one of the major milestones that we've had recently is the endorsement of an independent smallholder standard within the RSPO as of 2019. So with the idea of looking at bringing in more smallholders into the RSPO ecosystem, we have included a stepwise approach in the standards, in the smallholder standard. And part of this, or part of the targets of the smallholder standard, is to really look at poverty elevation and livelihoods. So in that sense, what we've done is our standards actually sort of progressively move our members, or the ISH members, independent smallholder members, towards increasing their earning capacity. And I think that's the starting point towards moving towards the living income discussions. We haven't quite gone down to looking at how are we metrifying this yet, but I think it is in the works. And in the few years that we review the standards of the ISH standards, we would probably bring this into the to look at the living income aspect a little more with a little bit more detail. But
Okay.
for now, it is embedded into the standards, but you wouldn't see the word living income in the standards.
Okay, thanks, Kamini. And also just a clarification for responding to another question that came up. So the Global Living Wage Coalition benchmarks that are produced for living wage actually do also report this living income figure as part of the report. So if you're interested in using a study for living income or for living wage, that can be done. Carla, we also have a question here about living wages in a country and whether they differ by sector. Can you tell us something about how, whether the definition of living wage in a particular place, is it the same for all sectors or is it different?
Right. In our understanding, what changes is the wages that are being paid, right? Within a country that maybe produce tobacco and tea, the wages for both sectors might be different. But the cost of living, if it's in the same area, would be the same. So the cost of living, the cost of housing, the cost of food will be the same. So the benchmark is the same. What changes then is the salary. So the gap would be different, right? The gap in the tobacco industry would be different than in the tea industry, but the North Star on what's the living wage would be the same.
Yeah. And I think this is important because it does suggest that these estimates of living wage can be used for multiple industries in one place. And also that you could think about living wage from a landscape or a regional perspective, right? What are we doing for all industries? Kamini, we have a couple questions here about the timelines for your work on benchmarks. So the benchmarks that you're working on, specifically Indonesia and Malaysia, but maybe more generally, do you have any idea of what your timeline is for producing these?
So yeah, we are already working on it, and we are looking at perhaps releasing the benchmarks, or we've targeted to release benchmarks by 2022. But again, we're looking at 16 countries. So what we're starting with is to actually have a decent living wage task force within the RSPO, which would comprise of membership of all sectors. But more importantly, we are bringing in experience from our members who have already started doing the work on living wages. And together with that, we will be working with our local partners as well, looking into how we could then get the estimates on the ground, and working with other partners as well to see how then do we move this forward in the most effective and credible way.
Okay, thank you. Now you raised the issue also about the question of migrant workers. Now we have one comment here from someone who says that they feel strongly that workers should be paid the living wage based on where they work, not where they're from. So that's certainly one of the questions that needs to be resolved. There's also a question here about hired workers working for smallholders. So could you, Kamini, tell us something about what your standard says about that, whether the requirements are also for workers working for smallholders? And Carla, maybe you could also tell us about what's happening in other sectors with regard to that, workers working for smallholders.
So I'll take the question first.
Yeah.
So it depends. It depends what kind of smallholding this is. If it is a scheme smallholder and you are complying by the principles and criteria, the RSPO's principles and criteria, then yes, the requirement for the payment of a decent living wage will extend to workers on scheme smallholdings. However, if you are within or you're a smallholder within the independent smallholder standards, then the minimum wages of that particular country will apply.
Carla?
To take yes, indeed, that's a tricky one, right? I would be honest. To track wages in a supply chain is already challenging. To track wages that are being paid by a smallholder to workers is then another layer of complexity. So that's definitely something we want to tackle. But right now, what we are doing is working very closely with the standards and following their guidance on how they are already doing this within the standard, right? And one of the ways to work around that right now is to look at smallholder farmers that have more than 5 workers. If they have more than 5 workers, then we are applying the salary matrix in this smallholder farming setting. If they have less than 5 workers, so far, we are not getting there. That doesn't mean that we will not get there, right? But as you can imagine, mapping the banana supply chain is right now meaning that we need to apply the salary matrix in more than 300 facilities. So that's going to be the first step this year. Next year, we need to start getting sharper on how we make sure we cover all workers, which includes workers for smallholder farmers, and how we get this data, right? And how we track the validity of this data, not only once, but over time. So we hope that we can work very closely with standards since they have already a lot of resources on the ground for this to happen.
Thanks, Carla. So we're just about at time here. I'm going to turn it back to you to see if there's any closing remark or something that wasn't asked that each of you would like to share with the audience. We have 2.5 minutes to go.
I can go first.
Go ahead.
To share an example from another sector, some of the audience maybe have heard about the work I briefly touched on tea, but to our understanding, the tea sector was one of the first that work on the topic of living wage. And we have a very interesting example in Malawi. That's where we started, where we had almost half of the buyers committed towards closing the living wage gap and all the producers in the country. So that's where our experience started with several other players and also several other standards working with us on the tea sector. So I will encourage the audience to also look at these other examples on other sectors, how they have done it. And I have already shared several of the learnings. But it is a very interesting example. This year, this project is ended. We have managed to close the living wage by certain percentage, but not 100%, since when we started, the gap was 50%, right? So when the gap is so big as 50%, there are so many structural issues that need to be addressed that there are many angles that you need to tackle this. But I will encourage and will happy to share more about this example and all.
Great, thank you. Kamini, last words?
Yeah, I think following from what Carla has just said, we see more and more, or at least we are learning as we go into this, delve into this deeper, that it is not a one sector or one party initiative. This is something that needs to be done together as an industry. And I think the suggestions that Carla gave, when we look at your commitments as markets, you look at your commitments, you look at the targets. I think this is really important because at the end of the day, we're looking at poverty elevation of the core people who are actually, making this a reality, making this commodity a reality. So we need to look at it from a very inclusive and a holistic perspective, and it needs to be done together. So I think learning from other commodities, it's not going to be an easy journey, but I definitely don't think it's impossible.
Great, thanks for those closing thoughts. So just to everyone, we're going to close off now, and you will be sent back into the lobby where there's going to be a summary of the breakout sessions. So hopefully we'll see all of you there. Thank you very much, Carla and Kamini, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.